Great. So thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today again. So this event is part of an ongoing free series called Virtual Talks with Video Activists, which creates conversations surrounding media production, and they are every 2 weeks on Zoom. They are free, and you can check out mediaburn.org to find out about future events and to watch the recordings of past events. So tonight we are very excited to be presenting a preview screening and discussion of portions of the upcoming documentary Southeast, A City Within a City, and to be joined by the film's director, Stephen Walsh. He will be in conversation with MIT professor of anthropology, Christine Walley, both of them natives of this region that's going to be depicted in this film. So just a couple things to think about during the event. Please, we want this to be interactive, and we want you to get a chance to talk with the filmmaker and the moderator, but while we're screening the film, please stay muted so that we can all hear everything very well. So we're going to screen short segments with discussion in between. So feel free to start typing your comments in the chat as you have them. Or during the discussion period, you can also raise your hand. If you go to the bottom of the screen, there's a little button that says reactions. You can use that to put your hand up, and then we'll be able to see that you want to go on screen and ask a question. So either way is fine. I also want to, maybe should have mentioned here, but note that if you would like there to be captions on the screen, just navigate to the bottom of your screen and there's a button to turn on the captions. So I encourage you to use those captions if you would like to. And so the other thing to note is that if you are on your phone, the main screen may not be highlighted for you. And so you may need to swipe to the left to find the spotlight view. That's what I've been told to say. So if you're on your phone, you're having trouble with the spotlight, you can maybe reach out to us privately and we can help. But with that, I would like to turn it over to Stephen and Christine, and they're going to introduce the clip, and then we'll get started with the screening. So enjoy.
Thank you. Very happy to be here. My name again is Stephen Walsh, and I'm the film's director. I've been working on this project fully for about 3-4 years, mainly since the pandemic started, but I've been recording the content for this project ever since I learned how to pick up a camera, which was about 7 years ago. I was originally a teacher after college, and after I finished grad school, I moved back to Chicago, where I was starting my business, which is a creative agency. And I was filming a bunch of things to get practice and to learn how to use a camera. And I was filming my grandfather a lot because he was at home and I was at home because I was just getting started and just moving here. And that's really where the journey began. I was filming my grandfather, trying to practice how to shoot, use the camera, get lighting, understand how to tell a story. And that's where I fell in love with his story. And he's the main character of my story now. He moved from San Antonio, like a lot of Mexican Americans, in 1952. He was 2 years old, and he moved here because his father wanted to work in the steel mills. He had family that moved here first, and they let him know that there were jobs. And like so many other immigrants, that's the story of how we got here. And when I was born, there wasn't a steel mill operating. And I didn't really understand how that could have even happened at that age. And it was only after I started recording him that I realized how beautiful and tragic the story is of the Southeast side. So in addition to the conversations I had with him, I started to interview other individuals from the community so that I could learn more about what happened. And that's where I met our moderator, Christine Walley, because I read her book and I watched the documentary that her and her husband put together called Exit Zero. And essentially that was the starting ground for my story. I realized that though there was a lot of information and data about the steel mills, it was still a story that many people, even in Chicago, didn't know about, let alone my generation growing up in my own neighborhood. They didn't know. We just had a bunch of older, grandfathers who didn't have jobs, and we just thought that was normal. So that's really what happened. I reached out to individuals, interviewed them, and they ranged from Vietnam veterans to individuals that worked at the steel mills, to teachers, to musicians, to painters, to see what happened and to understand how in 20 years we had a community that was bright and magical and full of life to the community that I grew up in, which was dangerous, which was empty, a ghost town, so many people refer it to. So that's the story. And we're going to begin with the good old days, which was right when my grandfather was moving to the southeast side. And it is the introduction to all of the characters that are featured throughout the documentary. So this is part one, and it's called Paradise and From Diploma to Hard Hat.
South Chicago was a booming area. There were stores, there were taverns in the corners. It was a lot of people, a lot of action. There was a lot of things going on. The economy was good. Everybody was getting that paycheck every other week.
Era un negociazo. No te imaginas tú la cantidad de negocios. Ahí por la 92, haz de cuenta que andabas en Las Vegas.
We had the steel mill, we had all the lounges, we had everything. We had cars, we used to pick reefer on Avenue O. We had it all. That was South Chicago.
Back from when I was young, it was thriving. All the steel mills were working, everybody had money. Commercial Avenue was beautiful. Ladies used to wear white gloves and hats and purses, and gentlemen used to wear suits all the time. To the right of me were Polish people. To the left of me were Serbian people. Down the street, Irish people, Mexican people.
My father brought us here in a truck from San Antonio, Texas. And when I was 2 years old, I came with the family. We jumped out the truck and there was kids all in front of our house and they were playing. I guess that was the norm. They were sitting there playing jacks on the sidewalk, and kids were playing marbles and shit, and they were just talking trash, kid shit. And mind you now, I didn't know how to speak English. I was a stone Mexican when I came, and 2 weeks later I couldn't speak Spanish anymore.
Most of the people who lived in the area had been immigrants from one place or another and had all these different kinds of backgrounds. So it was incredibly cosmopolitan in some ways, but people kind of had their little insular world. So people would walk to work and you'd have your church right there, and there'd be a tavern right there, and they would shop there. They just had really tight social bonds. And again, people stayed over generations because the work was so stable.
It used to glow, okay? That's a lot of money. Everybody in the neighborhood had money because they were making money at the mills. It wasn't getting laid off at that time. It was like, if you got fired from one mill, next week you'd be working at another mill, okay? So the work was plentiful.
It wasn't a kind of a by class sort of isolation, and we all went to school together. All the kids went to school together. Mostly the people spoke English, but with some difficulty. And most of them were there to give their kids a better break.
We got along. The people in the neighborhood got along. We respected each other. I could remember coming home and people would be sitting on the porch talking. Or there'd be kids outside playing at 1 or 2 in the morning. There'd be kids playing, running around on a weekend. Something you don't see nowadays.
Podías andar a las 2, 3 de la mañana en la calle, tranquilos. Te estoy hablando del 73. Pues hasta la fecha ha cambiado mucho. Pero en aquellos tiempos era muy bonito.
It was the kind of community that you want your kids to grow up in. People sitting on the porch in the summer. Labor Day was always a big festival. We celebrated our workers. We idolized those people. So they built this city.
Chicago, a city of beauty, strength, and power. Chicago, commercial capital of the nation, agricultural market and industrial center of the world. Chicago, the most American of American cities. Towers reaching to the sky, man-made mountains of steel and stone, engineering masterpieces. We passed the luxurious South Shore Country Club on the way to one of the city's mightiest industries, steel, which symbolizes the force and dynamic energy of a great city. The nation's largest steel mills are located in the Chicago area. This is due again to the abundant labor supply, coupled with unparalleled transportation facilities and proximity to raw materials.
There were a lot of things that the mill did in terms of the larger society. So they had representatives, administrators who would be out working with the people, finding out what their needs were. They sponsored sports teams. They had their own choir. This gives you a sense of that it was more than just a place to work. There were other things also that were going on. And I'm not saying it was the greatest place to work. It was just the main source in this area. Like 20,000 people at one time. Wow.
I remember one time I told my father, I want to go to the Art Institute. First thing that came out of his mouth, he goes, "Are you crazy? How are you going to feed your family?" See, the idea of those days, education wasn't in colleges. It was in the iron workers, the carpenters union, electrical union. You know, this was making it. They didn't need geniuses or people to go to colleges and this and that in those years. They needed laborers. They needed people to go to work in the mill. Because all this neighborhood ever thought about, that mill was never going to disappear. The mill was going to be here forever. So all of us that grew up in that period, we were geared to be workers.
Welcome to the southeast side of Chicago, land of the mighty, mighty steel industry and home to all people. It's a place that puts our community first. One mill alone here employs over 20,000 people. That's a heck of a lot of work to go along. The steel coming out of our mills helped build this beautiful city and many of the major bridges and skyscrapers of this wonderful country, the United States of America. We even use our slag byproduct to create the very land we build our houses on. Because here in Southeast Chicago, all we know is steel. It doesn't matter who you are or where you're from, here in Southeast Chicago, there's a place and a job for you. We'll even provide the steel for you to build your home with. It's a dream guaranteed. So join our family and help us build the world of tomorrow together.
The steel coming out of the mills in this ward built the John Hancock, the Sears Tower, the Aon building. I mean, you look downtown, that steel came from here. And you know, that's something to be proud of. It's really something to be proud of.
What these mills really represent is American industry and American jobs, just being able to produce and to have a product in our hands that, you know, you saw Made in USA, and then right below it you saw an address, and sometimes it said Made in Chicago.
My dad was a steel worker from the time that he came from Poland. He worked for Inland in East Chicago. Whenever I passed it, if we were driving by or in the bus or anything like that, it would be like a fire-breathing dragon. And at that time, in order to encourage immigrants to come, the company offered them materials to build their own houses. So then it was a matter of, okay, we're going to have a job and we're going to have a place to live.
It was a great opportunity for a lot of immigrants, for a lot of people in general, to just work for a mill and then have a strong foundation for their families. Not many other places in the country or the world, for that matter, provided that to people.
The high school, these sales at the time, if you maintained a certain average, C average, okay, in the summertime, they used to get jobs, summer jobs for the mill, okay?
In high school, we didn't have college fairs, we had mill fairs. The mills would come to your school and literally like sign you up, and you would graduate and go straight to work in the mill, making 18 bucks an hour in like 1977.
That's how the mills influenced the neighborhood. They were the juice, they were the candy, they were everything, they were the water.
The steelworks were 15 miles away, and as usual, it was so contrived that one had to pay 2 fares to get there. Far and wide, the sky was flaring with red glare that leaped from rows of towering chimneys. The vast works, a city in themselves, were surrounded by a blockade, and already a full 100 men were waiting at the gate where new hands were taken on. The men in these mills were all black with soot and hollow-eyed and gaunt. They worked with fierce intensity, rushing here and there, and never lifting their eyes from their tasks. They knew that if they were hurt, they would be flung aside and forgotten. And still they would hurry to their task by dangerous shortcuts, would use methods that were quicker and more effective in spite of the fact that they were also risky. So that was an introduction. Christine, I didn't mean to interrupt. I'll let you go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I just forgot to preface that, the idea of this is a lot more than just a documentary. And I guess that's something I ever market enough. But as I watch it, I realize that I'm not a documentarian, or at least I've never made a documentary before. So this is my first time. And to be honest with you, I don't really even watch that many documentaries. And so that was a big part of my direction. And I guess I should have stated at the start, where I do think the element of documentary is the meat of this, but there are all these other elements that I found very important, using archival footage. That mini commercial on steel mill, I wrote that myself, and that was just my friend, and we just recorded it in here pretty much. So there's a lot of things that I think step away from your traditional documentary, but that's a big part for me. I think I wanted to do that to, as my first style of direction, really.
Great, thank you. And I'm sure lots of people are going to have lots of questions to jump in with right away. But just to start things off, I might start with a question. And just to preface by saying I'm a huge fan of this film. I absolutely adore this film. And I adore it at 2 different levels. One is just somebody who grew up in Southeast Chicago, whose family went through similar kinds of things. And actually, my mom and sister still live there, just a couple blocks away from Steve's family. So I watch it with that hat as somebody from Southeast Chicago. And then also I'm an academic and anthropologist who does work on deindustrialization and the impact of deindustrialization. So I watch it with that hat and adore it with that hat as well. And think it's just so important for my students and for other folks to be talking about. So anyway, so bravo. And thank you so much, Steve. And just to kind of start off the conversation. So you had talked at the beginning about sort of how you got into this personally through your grandfather's story, and sort of, for the younger generation, my generation, is sort of my dad's generation who lost the jobs. And so this was part of my childhood, is watching the kind of, mills collapse and the impact that had on the older generation. And as you're saying, for your generation, the mills were already down. It was your grandparents' generation. And so you come into your experience of the world with this thing having already happened and not necessarily a lot of people talking about it. And so I was just curious in terms of your process of exploration, and I know you've really gotten into the history of the area. So in sort of digging into the history of the mills and what work was like in the mills and what it meant for people, I was just wondering if you could tell us a little bit about sort of what surprised you in that exploration, in that journey. What were things you didn't expect? And, how did that change your understanding of your grandfather or maybe kind of other folks in that earlier generation?
Oh, in so many ways. I mean, it's almost like when it comes specifically to my grandfather, it's almost like watching Star Wars the way Star Wars came out, where you're introduced to Darth Vader, and then I met Anakin Skywalker. And that's like a big part of the story for not only for my grandfather, but for the neighborhood as a whole. I really felt like I can compare it to so many other big, well-known places. And once I do, it ignites a sadness in people because then they can relate. But I think what I learned here, in terms of the individuals is, don't judge a book by its cover. I think that's a big part of not only like for my grandfather, but again, for my community where, my grandfather was a, older, drunk, kind of always mad guy my whole life. He had this beautiful spirit inside of him. And there was always these moments where he just shined. As you see in the film, he's funny. He's so funny. He's so charismatic. He's so smart. He's one of the smartest people I've ever met. But when I was growing up, he was sad. He was broken. And I just thought that's how he always was. So to learn that he had just lost his job, he's a couple years off of being unemployed. He was kind of at his rock bottom state, but that's when I met him. And I think that has a lot to say about the neighborhood too. I grew up, and I think I can compare it now that I'm growing more into my understanding of history, that must be a lot like the Dark Ages when Rome just left Britain, in the sense of you see these giant monuments that nothing has been built since then that's bigger. And that it wasn't during your lifetime, it just existed before. So I feel like when I think of what people think of our neighborhood, that's what I like to compare it to. It was like this infrastructure left, and then we had to pick up the pieces. But I was born only at the end of that. So I thought that that's what it was. So I think that's something I learned a lot, understanding how you can get involved and change things, how you can learn about these things happening and try to catch wind beforehand. I mean, this one of the biggest things to me is that we still don't really know how we could have gone about doing this in a better way. I mean, there are ways, but I think that fascinates me, Chris. Something we talk about a lot is there's still not even all the data collected as to exactly how many people lost their jobs and how many people were affected. So another thing was just realizing that, this is still fresh. It's not that far away. So you would think we have all the answers, but we don't. So there's still so much more to do on the ground in terms of figuring out what this has done. And it's still unfolding. I'm the first generation to have not seen it in my family. And I think that plays a big effect to where I'm buying my home, where I'm raising my daughter, where I want her to go to school, what air is she breathing, what jobs are available for her and activities growing up. I mean, it's fascinating how not only, right now you see the effects, but what happened to get us there. Another quick thing is just the race relations and how that had played an effect because of the steel mill. Learning about scab workers, learning about how they were pretty much pitting people against each other in order to keep costs down, and what effect that has outside of work, let alone inside work. So families coming in, the new people on the block were not necessarily greeted warmly. And I feel like you start to see, some factors as to why. And I think that was another very interesting point.
Thanks, Steve. Those are both really great points. And just a quick follow-up on the first point. I mean, so for academics who are doing work on deindustrialization, a lot of the thought was like, like after a generation, something else will come into these places and it'll be over in a generation. And what deindustrialization scholars now are talking about is what they refer to as the long half-life of deindustrialization, mainly that the effects are so long-term, and we're seeing this multiple generations down in these areas in ways that aren't always as clear as the past, because sometimes kind of the ruins of the mills aren't necessarily always there, but there's these long-term family and neighborhood kind of effects as well as economic effects that are really profound for people. But let's open it up to others right now. And there's a question in the chat, Steve, and others, if you want to put your Zoom hand up, feel free. But one question in the chat from John Hanson was, how did your family make a life, Steve, in South Chicago? How did it pick up the pieces after the mills closed? And how did the community get rebuilt as a community?
Well, I'll get back into that second half as you see the other parts. But I mean, really what happened is Darth Vader. There's no other way to put it. My grandfather turned to a life of crime. He couldn't get a job, couldn't find a job. So, he got into the black market. He eventually was imprisoned, joined a gang, started a gang. He had a community club, which we're not going to get to see today, but he started a community club with his friends that eventually turned into a street gang because everybody lost their jobs or came back from the war and didn't have employment. And so they had to figure out their own ways. And then, my father saw that, and my father lived a very similar life. So to really go back to even what you were saying, Chris, is that, the stuff you don't necessarily see on paper is a grandfather telling a grandson certain things about how you should do what you should do in life because of his experience. My gramps was like, don't learn about how to work with your hands. Go to college, which I'm happy for, because college was great for me. But I know so many people that went to college and have a giant amount of debt and they didn't necessarily find a job they wanted. But the after effect of deindustrialization was everyone told us to go to college, and there wasn't enough college jobs for all of us. And now we're in this situation where we have a big old giant bubble full of debt, because I think, and this is what I mean about all these stories interweaving. So that's essentially what happened. My dad was imprisoned at the beginning of my life when I was born. And it took him a long time, both him and my grandfather, to get out of that, to find purpose, figure out what to do with their lives. Fortunately, they both did, but for so many, that wasn't the case.
Thank you, Steve. That was very insightful. Other folks who have any questions for this segment of the documentary?
Yeah, and if not, we can move on. We got more. I want to make sure hopefully we can get to the third part.
Okay, maybe we should hop into the second part, because I think, even the question that was asked, as you say, the next segments of the film are going to get into some of those issues.
Yeah. So I guess just to quickly introduce this, what we just saw was the good old days. We're having some parts in the middle about individuals going to Vietnam. Played a big role in our community. We had a lot of individuals that went to Vietnam. Also about how race and how ethnicities played a factor into not only the steel mills, but the community. So what we're about to get into right now is essentially the downfall. This is where the steel mills close. So this section is essentially chronologically around 1980. When the first steel mill closes, which we'll all see right now. This section is called Crumbling Down.
I came back from Vietnam in 1970. They trained us, we seen things, we did things, okay, that people wouldn't even imagine, okay? So when it came to, hey, what about me? What about, jobs for us? We couldn't get any, okay? So if you were applying for a job, okay, it's best not even to say you're any military status, because you were considered a baby killer, okay, or unstable.
They didn't have the programs for people who came back with PTSD, who had alcohol, drug problem, family problems.
The psychological repercussions of something like that, a lot of people came home and turned to drugs and alcohol because there was no help. There was no help for any of these guys or women.
And then there was a lot of politics behind it. So, and the little guy, which was the soldiers, got fucked over it, okay?
I saw the mills, okay? And I worked in the mills for 10 years. And I dealt with the mills. But then you start seeing a lot of Japanese groups come in and they're taking pictures with cameras and whatnot, and they're getting the game and they're stealing it. And they let them, and they got the game, and they're gone. Once they were gone, all they had to do was tell the United States, hey, we can make it cheaper, we can give it to you better, this and that. And we had no choice, the mills had to close.
It was the competition that was winning customers while we were losing customers. None of the mills, as I understand it, was able to keep up with that competition, or maybe even tried.
You know, you're looking at Chinese and Indian steel coming in, and they're able to produce it at such a reduced cost, and it comes at a cost. And it happened all throughout the country.
There are also government policies at play. For example, in the early 80s, the U.S. government was fighting inflation, and so they deliberately overvalued the dollar, so it made steel exports too expensive to buy in an international market.
Production goes down, your quotas go down, less workers are needed to meet those quotas. It's a whole cycle.
¿Cuántos empleos no se perdieron? Miles y miles de empleos. Cada persona, ¿cuántos mantenía en su hogar?
Different mills died differently. So Wisconsin Steel sort of had a heart attack. It happened like overnight. And it was stunning. 3,000 guys lost their jobs overnight. Even when it closed, we thought that the blast furnaces would still be there like mountains. Well, they disappeared quickly.
They went bankrupt, and then they screwed over thousands of workers. You know, they couldn't walk in, they couldn't get their belongings from their lockers. They were just locked out, left out in the breeze to go sort it out themselves. And that's because of corporate greed.
Not only that, but also any checks that they had deposited to their accounts, that money was withdrawn and sent to the company.
When that mill closed, somehow or another, they took their credit union money. I'm talking about their life savings. This is what these people were putting together for when they got old enough and they had that money, and then all of a sudden they took it.
I worked 25 years at Wisconsin Steel. I'm supposed to get a pension, but I'm not receiving that pension from the mill. I'm supposed to get an average of $5,500. I'm not getting nothing from them. The only thing that I'm getting from is the PBGC. That's a government guarantee board. They pay me $204 a month. And that's a slap in the face. For 25 years, I worked in that mill, and I did my job. And I'll tell you this, the United States government ought to take care of the worker, because I took care of this United States government. I had brother in Vietnam. I had brother in the Cuban crisis. I paid my taxes. I did everything right.
Southworks died a slow death. And you could tell, despite the fact that the space was huge, that it was sort of shutting off certain sections gradually.
At the same time, when they were shutting down Southworks and 6 other mills, they had bought Marathon Oil to diversify, and that's when they changed their name to USX. They took the steel out.
When that U.S. Steel shut down, okay, the companies they built in Japan were going real good. So they weren't taking it that much of a hit. It was better for them to shut down this old stuff, okay, and they still making money over there and shipping it here. So you lost all kinds of jobs in different ways.
So in Southeast Chicago, you've lost maybe total up to 30,000 jobs from the peak of the steel industry until when everything shut down.
One of the real problems was that there were not alternatives in terms of employment, where you might have some sort of sense of security.
And people would try to get jobs. And, I remember my dad back in the day, you'd go to put in an application and there'd be thousands of other people like waiting in line trying to put in an application too.
And they had you running all over the fucking neighborhoods with a book saying that you went there to look for a job. There were 5, 10 of us in a row. And we're all going in. You got a job? No. Okay. You got a job? No. Okay.
There should have been intervention. There should have been by who? The government? Yeah, you're fucking right, the government. Who else is gonna come in? It's gonna be us helping our. It was like divide and conquer. It was like, nah, sink or swim. They're gonna sink.
The beginning of poverty, when everything goes numb and you don't know what your next step is going to be.
When the steel mills closed, what else was there for us? You didn't replace the steel mills and give us other industry. You didn't replace the steel mills and say, here is an opportunity for post-secondary options. You closed the steel mills and you left us. You left us.
They were simply not counting him at all. He was of no consequence. He was flung aside like a bit of trash, the carcass of some animal. They had ground him beneath their heel. They had devoured all his substance, and now they were through with him. They had no further use for him.
Thank you. Thank you for that clip. And I think it really conveys so powerfully a lot of what happened. And as it gets mentioned in that clip, so within Southeast Chicago, there are like 30 to 35,000 steel workers in that area, but then you have the larger Calumet region as a whole, where kind of peak industry was about 120,000 steel workers across both Northwest Indiana and Southeast Chicago. So you have a place like Inland Steel that's still technically going, but it's down from like 25,000 workers to about 3,000 today. So it just gives you some sense of the scale of what was happening. So Stephen, this is implicit in that segment of the film, but I was wondering if you could talk about it a bit more. Like, one of the things that people in Southeast Chicago always talk about is how people in other parts of the city don't know about this area. It's like the area they go over on the Skyway, right? And it's like, my husband's family used to say that when they would come in from Indiana. It's like, oh, that stinky place down there underneath the Skyway. But people didn't actually know about it. And when you could be in Lincoln Park and tell somebody you're from the East Side, and people would be like, East Side of what? There is no East Side in Chicago. You grew up in the lake or something. So like the area is often not very much known even within Chicago. And certainly about what happened after when the steel mills closed, there's a lot that people don't know about this area in other parts of the city as well as other parts of the country. So for you, what do you think is important for that you would like other people elsewhere, whether elsewhere in Chicago or elsewhere, what would you like people to understand about what happened that you've kind of learned from this process of making the film that you think it's important for them to know about this area and others like it?
Mm-hmm. I think what I've noticed so far in my life is that there's a certain connotation people have when they do know of people from the Southeast Side, and it's never usually a good one. We're usually the rough around the edges, blunt, in your face, tell it like it is type of people, which a part of me is very prideful of. I don't mind it personally. I like knowing that I think there's so many different cultures that it's a combination of all the cultures that came in, and I think what a blue collar job does to a family that'll lead everyone to have that type of attitude. But I was thinking about it while I was watching this. I've been to a few, parties and social gatherings where somebody says that they lost their job, and like what energy that does to a party. Everyone's laughing and smiling, and someone's like, oh, I just lost my job. And it's like, oh, you know, it's almost like you can feel the energy leave. And can you imagine what happened when everyone lost their job? Like, it probably wasn't no parties, let alone, like, you see how an attitude of a community changes and evolves through time because of external factors and internal factors. But I think that's something that I want people to see, that like and especially during my grandfather's time, was a true melting pot. I mean, I think there's probably pound for pound more half Polish, half Mexican people in that community than anywhere in the world. I want to say in the entire world. I don't know if there's data on that, but, you know, I think when I see things like that, nobody talks about that. People from Chicago didn't even know Mexicans were down there. It's like known as an all black, you know, you say the Southeast side or the South side, it's like people think it's an all black neighborhood, but, you know, like, you know, your family's down the block from my family. There's Irish people right next to me. There's Serbians, Croatians, Italians, Black, some Native Americans, Puerto Ricans. And I can imagine what that was like before. I could imagine what the streets smelled like, all of that food and what the liveliness of the music and the art. I can picture it. So, you know, and even now you still see those remnants. A lot of it is gone. It's like faded art, you know, you can see it. It's still there. So for me growing up, you know, I had a lot of friends that, you know, didn't realize like how fortunate we were to grow up together. You know, Chicago is kind of like a diverse city, but it's also very segregated. But when you come to our neighborhood at certain points in history, and some parts of that I didn't even put in the film was some of this data. Like I looked through the census data going throughout the decades and how it changed. And there were certain points where it was crazy to see how many different flags represented one street block. I mean, there was Austrian and Swedish, and then the Great Chicago Fire changed things. And you see all of this movement, and it's so beautiful. And people don't see that, you know, they honestly just see the current. And I think something for me that's important is for people to understand that our neighborhood, like all neighborhoods, it just depends on what lens you're looking at and at what time frame you're looking at and from what position you're looking at. And ours is just so much more intricate than I think people give it.
Thank you so much, Steve. And if people have questions, again, please raise your Zoom hand and it'll pop up at the top. I don't see any yet, but I do have a question while other people are formulating theirs. And this is, you know, I know a lot of, with conversations with folks elsewhere, also the issue around health effects always come up because, you know, the industry down there was super polluting and there were a lot of health effects for people. I know a lot of folks in my own family, including myself, we all know lots of people in the area who've had health effects because of the pollution there. On the other hand, the loss of the jobs also created huge health effects as well. So the fact when people lost those jobs, the suicide rates escalated radically, the rates of alcoholism, the rates of addiction, the rates of heart disease, other kinds of stress-related illnesses. And the fact, and this is something that's different about deindustrialization in the US as opposed to other wealthy countries. In other wealthy countries, you have nationalized healthcare. And in the US, because it's tied to your job, so you have all these people losing their jobs and having these stress-related illnesses and also losing their healthcare at the same time. And so it's this kind of, you know, intense contradiction in Southeast Chicago where there's the health effects from living in that kind of industrial space, and there's also the health effects from losing those jobs at the same time, and that kind of crazy contradiction where people often get made to feel like they're forced to choose between one or the other, like the environment or the jobs, when you have to have both to have a thriving community. So that's just something I wanted to kind of throw out as well. But other folks in the audience, do you have other questions for Steve about these or any other issues? Please unmute and speak up. Well, while we're waiting for others to think about things, Steve, so on the environmental end, because I know you've also been, I mean, this gets into the later bit, and I'm not sure how we're doing on time, if you're going to have a chance to show that last clip. Maybe there'll be time. But so you've been covering also, here's a question came in, but we could, you know, if there's more to talk about on the environmental end later on as well. So a question from Dan Kissinger. How did you balance the panacea of economic stability with the reality of those health effects for workers? how do you balance the panacea of economic stability with the reality of health effects? Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really great question. I think that's the key question. But I think, I mean, Steve, I'd be curious to know what you think. I mean, there's a lot of environmental activism in Southeast Chicago, but I do think a lot of people get kind of made to feel like they kind of have to choose one or the other, where again, in my view anyway, people shouldn't feel like they have to choose between having a job that pays a living wage and having to live in a kind of super polluting, unhealthy environment. And, you know, I think maybe we need to think bigger about, you know, why is it that people kind of feel like they're put into those kinds of positions?
Yeah.
I don't know if you have thoughts on this.
Yeah, I mean, you know, I know we had talked about it. I think it's fascinating that in the same community, you can have dinner with the family, and you got one individual that was protesting because they wanted those smokestacks back in the community. And then you have that individual's child or grandchild who's protesting because they don't want smokestacks in the community. And it's the same family. So to think about how complicated this is and the effects that it's had, like I said, generationally, where, you know, if you were to poll the community right now, the number one concern is jobs. You know, the number 3 or 4 concern is environment. But that's, you know, holistically. If you polled the younger generation, their number one concern is environment. And if you polled the older generation, their number one concern is jobs. So I think it's fascinating to see like how we're at a point where you have people arguing at a dinner table because we're programmed almost to think that we have to choose between breathing healthy or feeding the family. So it's an ongoing effect. I mean, I'm seeing it now with some of my friends, and, you know, we have an aldermanic race going on and people are taking different stances on things, and you're seeing how it's, you know, dividing people because we are under the assumption that we can't have both. And I think that's, yeah, you know, it's insane to think that we're conditioned that way because of time and experience. So, you know, it's still an ongoing effect, and you know, that it's hard to even think about how to answer without going on and on and on.
Mm-hmm. And there's another question that came in. Then, did the churches step up either with aid or with pressures on government?
I mean, I don't know. You might be able to answer that a little better than me, because I don't know. I'd imagine in whatever capacity they could, but what can you do?
Yeah, I would agree with that. That there were a fair number. I mean, not always, but there were some, you know, priests and pastors from the different churches who, you know, were out there, you know, kind of, you know, picketing along with steelworkers and, trying to get aid to families in whatever way they could, and doing food pantries and other things. And so I think, actually, even at my mom's church in Southeast Chicago, the most recent pastor, I mean, he, in his sermons, he gets up there and he talks about the impact of deindustrialization on people in the area. It's part of his sermon. So I think the churches did try to, as Steve is saying, sort of, what could they do when you're talking about such a massive amount of job loss? And another thing I would just throw out too, there are some industrial jobs that remain in the area, but one of the things that's happened with the newer jobs is a lot of the newer jobs are more kind of temp work or contract work or non-union work. So even if there are some industrial jobs remaining, they're not the kind of good jobs of the old era. So that becomes the question too, whether they're service jobs or some other kind of jobs. How do you make sure that they're actually good jobs for people? And here's a question from Matthew Kaplan, who's, for those of you who know his work, who does absolutely gorgeous photographs. He's from Northwest Indiana, and he does gorgeous photographs of the region. He asked, why do you think the mills in Northwest Indiana are still operating while the ones in the Southeast Chicago have been closed for decades?
I think that you would know a lot more on that.
From what I understand, it's because of the different regulatory environments in Indiana and Illinois. Taxes being lower in Indiana, and also because less environmental regulation. And so, when US Steel decided, we're going to keep Southworks going, or are we going to keep Gary Works going? The fact that the Indiana mills stayed open is telling. But on the other hand, again, it's like, how do we think about what deindustrialization is? Like, even if you have Southworks and, what do they call inland now? Is it Cleveland Cliffs? I forget now, but the fact that, it's down to a few thousand workers in a place where Gary Works had about 30,000 and Inland had 25,000, and it's down to a few thousand for each.
So in terms of employment, it's still deindustrialization, even if like the amount of steel they make might still actually be the same. So yeah, I don't know if you have kind of further thoughts on this, Matthew, as somebody from Northwest Indiana. Yeah, the mills in Indiana were also newer, right? Exactly, and more efficiently laid out. Yep. Which was part of the reason also why like the Pittsburgh mills, those tended to be older mills. And so they actually had sort of deindustrialization happen there earlier than out in the Calumet region, because those mills were newer out this way. Yeah. So in terms of, I don't know, in terms of the last clip, how long the last clip is, Steve, or do you think there's
We'll
probably
pretty
not-
much be done right at, I think it might run a minute or two over, but if we started now, I think it's like 9-10 minutes. So I'd say we do it. Let's do it.
Okay.
Let's do it. Let's do it. This is the
Sounds
third
great.
clip, and this is essentially called Aftermath. And this is essentially what happened after the mills closed. This is the life that I knew.
When the mills closed, so did the restaurants, so did the shoe stores. It was just a trickle-down effect. And, it was kind of like, then it became survival of the fittest.
Nobody had money, so everybody like moved out the neighborhood. Things started changing. That's when you seen hungry people, children that were abused. That's when you seen that.
It was a high increase of alcoholism, suicide, drugs, exodus, people leaving, saying, this is it. I'm out of here.
Because it was all steel mill people. It was all steel mill people. But once the steel mills closed, it was abandoned. It was literally abandoned. There was empty homes everywhere, boarded up stores.
La economía se nos vino muy abajo. Cerraron muchos negocios aquí en Chicago, porque aquí en Chicago es la matriz de los negocios, digo, de las fundiciones. Y se acabó todo.
You had nothing. Everything else is gone. There's no other business. Okay? The little moms and pop stores, they were slowly all started, bars, they all started going down.
There was no people in the neighborhood. It's right now, you go to the bush, it's like a ghost town. There's no jobs. There's no work.
So when the steel mills started to close down and all these jobs were lost, the other issue too was it didn't only affect the steel workers and the other industries and businesses in the area, it had an absolutely devastating impact on families. There was a huge increase in the numbers of divorces. There was a lot of alcoholism that led to families splitting up as well. There's just a lot of economic stress.
That big stress, not knowing if you got, especially if you have kids, not knowing if you're going to be able to keep them going to school or have a roof over your head, you're not going to be thrown out in the street. That's a lot of stress.
being able to provide for your kids and have a decent living was so much bound up in the identity of people in the area. And I know at my dad's mill, Wisconsin Steel, less than 10 years after the mill closed, 800 out of the 3,400 workers at Wisconsin Steel were dead. And that was because of suicide, alcoholism, heart attacks, other kinds of health issues.
The best way to think about it is these guys had families, houses, cars, and how are they going to pay for it? I mean, just try to put yourself in that mentality where you had a great paying job, way to pay all the bills, and then all of a sudden, that's it. You know, figure it out. You're talking, 20, 30 years at a particular job, and now you're just left with nothing.
So after the mills closed then, for a lot of women in the area, they really became the financial breadwinners for their families. And often a lot of the men never worked again. And for a lot of them, I think they never recovered from seeing themselves as the supporters of their family to just not being able to economically contribute.
When you hear somebody say, hey, we didn't have a job. We lost our house. My dad killed himself. He was drinking. I said, that hits hard. And that's what was happening. That's the reality. That's the reality. The suicides through alcohol, the suicides through drugs. It's what you do because you get fed up.
We were always like the forgotten part of the city. And that's our past, because the jobs didn't come back.
All right, my name is Frank Lumpkin. I'm chairman of the Save Our Jobs Committee at Wisconsin Steel. I worked at Wisconsin Steel for 30 years and a week. And I know most of you know this was the first plant to go down in this area in 1980. And at this point, most of the plants have went down because of shipping out orders to foreign countries and coming into this place and using it. And I think it's about time the American public knows what's happening to the people. You can drive down any streets, you see eviction, you see homeless kids, and that's what's happening in the thing. The thing is boiling up into a null, and it's going to burst open. Any place in the world where you have the majority in poverty, there's problems. The humanitarian is gone, okay? So they have a resentment because you're keeping them at that level. You won't give them the opportunity to even grow from it.
When we look at the southeast side, and to be honest with you, look at the broader south side, what we see is when you pull capital and material well-being out of the community, you've pushed people to the brink, and they're going to do things in the shadow economy that are unsafe, not just for others, but for themselves.
That was where the most revenue source was black marketing, instead of the revenue source being businesses.
So yes, a lot of us did fall victim of the drug trade because there was nothing else. We had no choice. I mean, we had no choice. What were we supposed to do,
And so we do what people do who need to support themselves. We found a way, right? It's that story of resilience. We found a way. And regardless of that way, if it was illegal or scrupulous or whatever you'd like to call it, we still have to put food on our tables, and we still have to take care of our children. And if I understand this story from a parent's perspective, I'll do anything for my kids. And that's what they did.
Because you got to survive. Your family got to eat. I will never say that what we did was correct. No, it wasn't. But at the time, we did what we had to do.
When it comes down to it, if it comes to my family, I'm gonna do everything I can, okay, to provide for my kids, okay, whether I have to sacrifice myself or not.
He only knew that he was wronged, and that the world had wronged him, that the law, that society, that all its powers had declared itself his foe. And every hour his soul grew blacker. Every hour he dreamed new dreams of vengeance, of defiance, of raging, frenzied hate. So I know we're going past time, but that's essentially roughly the climax of the film. And it's sad to say that, that's a climax for someone. That was the once upon a time for my life. That was right when I was born, seeing these people at their, I think, worst state. Those are the people that raised me. And it's just so crazy to think about, what I would have been taught if they had a different life. But I was taught to steal and to con and to use my wit to do whatever I can to get by. And, these weren't bad people, but they were just put in a bad position, and they taught me what they knew. And so, I know that it seems like it's a very tragic way to end the story, but there's still so much more. My daughter's story is a very different once upon a time. And I think right now the community, though it's been really beat up, is doing some wonderful things. So I just didn't want to end it on too negative of a note. I know we didn't have enough time to show the whole film, but as it progresses, we see that there is still so much more hope. There's so many people that are out there trying to do things. But in reality, it's a tragedy. It is a tragic story what happened to us. And there's not many other places in the world that were wiped the way we were wiped. And there are so many reasons where we can, find out how that happened, but there's still so much to uncover because the story is not complete.
Thank you, Steve. That's so incredibly powerful. I don't know, Sarah, do we have time for a final question, or we have to kind of cut it off at this point?
If there is a final question, I did see one question I think would be great to address, which is someone asked, how do they see the full film? What kind of opportunities will there be in the future to watch the full film?
Yeah. So as you can see, we're very close to being finished. So some of the stuff that's not done, just so you know, is just some updates on the scoring. There's a few sections where I'm talking that I want to finish. So until it's absolutely finished, it's hard to say. My goal is for it to be streamed. I think PBS or Netflix or Hulu. Again, I've never done this before, so I don't really know what to do. But I'm hoping that it will, it's generating attraction. So I think it would be at least pitchable. I don't know how that world works. And in the meantime, I'm still trying to screen it as often as I could because I'm getting so much feedback. I'm learning. It's constantly changing. We're hoping the next 2 screenings that are going to happen are going to be at the Field Museum here in Chicago and at Cal Park, a couple blocks down on the southeast side. It's a big one I want to work on because I think that that's such a special and monumental park for the story. One will be in the spring and one will be in the summer. So I will be sure to send this invitation to Media Burn so they could reach out to everyone that came. But that's all I know for now. I don't have it up and online yet because it's just not finished, and I don't have all of the everything okay and license off. So my goal is by the summer it's finished. It's finished. It's just hard because uphill battle. I don't have all the budget that I'd like to get it done. So it's a matter of, do I do it anyways? Do I cut some corners, or do I try to find funding? So I think as of right now, we're going to do whatever we could to finish it without lessening the quality and get it done in a few months. Also, I got a few very nice personal messages. I just wanted to say thank you. It was so nice to hear people say that they enjoy the story. Again, I almost feel wrong telling it because it's really not my story. It's, the story of so many others that were a part of it. But it's an honor to tell it. And I honestly, it's changing my life because I'm really learning about the importance of understanding your neighborhood, where you're from, who made you. I think it has a lot to do with your character, whether you like it or not. And I'm learning it even as we talk today, as I hear about how this effect probably affected how people parent. That alone affects the entirety of the future. Just that alone, just those dinner table conversations, or lack of a dinner table conversations, because I didn't have too many of them because I didn't really have that wholesome family. And I didn't have that wholesome family because of so many extrinsic factors and external factors. It's fascinating to know. You can you can't really, and I'm sure Christine, you've been in that same spot where you were writing and making a doc. It's so hard to decide where to start it and where to end it, because we could have made a whole film on Mexicans in Vietnam on 105th and Avenue J. That would have been an entire 90 minutes or a 500-page book. So it's hard to tell the whole story. I'm doing what I can, but there's so many pieces I wish I could have included. The women's plight, the understanding of redlining, and understanding of how people couldn't leave that wanted to leave. I mean, it could have gone so many other ways, environmental concerns. So maybe this is just part one. I don't know. I have no idea, but I'm very much looking forward to continuing the journey.
Thank you so much. It's so fabulous, Steve. Thank you.
Stephen, can I talk? Can you hear me?
Yes. Hi.
Hi, this is Andy Davis. Can you send us some way that how you're raising funds where people can send money to you?
Yeah, sure. I would love to. I would love to. I will be sure.
Can Tom post that to everybody?
I would love that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, we will after tonight, we'll edit this recording, and then we'll send that out to you all, and we'll make sure to send links to the film, links to anything that I'll talk with Stephen what links, but yeah, we'll send you anything that there is to learn more about how to follow this film as its journey progresses.
And how to reach
I
you,
just want to say it blew me away in many ways, because it's so real and so unfiltered, and it's exactly what documentary does and express. And there's no baloney here. It's the real stuff. You say it isn't your story. Well, of course it's your story. You're telling the story. And thank you, Andy, for asking.
Thank you so much.
Stephen, I did love to share some stuff. I worked in the 12-inch mill at Republic Steel one summer.
Oh, okay. All right.
On a swing shift. And I wrote a note because when I was a kid, the Trumbull Park race riots occurred, which is a really important part of that story.
Yep. Another big element.
And the role of Eddie Sedlowski and what his role was. And what blew me away, was finding out that the Wisconsin steelworkers didn't get their pension money. That was incredible. It's got to be so illegal. That's
yeah, I can't even imagine. I just can't imagine. It's so hard. You see why things happen the way they did. I mean, imagine you wake up one day and everything's gone.
Yeah. The why is something different. The why is what you said, it's greed. And there's a lot of people who made out fine in those times, and they really didn't give a shit about any of the workers there. I mean, that's just the fact, and you've laid it out.
Yeah.
I would just mention for people who are interested in the history of the area, Steve has also done an amazing job of helping to collect materials from people, photographs and other things. And there's the Southeast Chicago Historical Museum in Cal Park, which has an amazing collection that goes back to the 80s. And so at sechicagohistory.org, you can find it online. It's called the Southeast Chicago Archive and Storytelling Project. And so, the discussion about Ed Sedlowski and Save Our Jobs Committee and a lot of the other things you're talking about, there's documentary materials that people in the area saved that are highlighted on that site. And again, Steve has brought in a bunch of stuff for that as well. So check it out if you're interested in more of those kinds of other issues in the area.
Yeah, it's a beautiful website. You learn so much from it. It's a wonderful website. I highly encourage people that are interested in this story, because I got so much of it from Christine, from the individuals at the museum. I couldn't have done it without. I mean, that's the best part about this film is the team effort. I mean, people from the community, there was no one that turned down. There was no one that turned down when I asked for help. Not a single person. Everybody helped, whether it was finding material, archiving material that they didn't even know was so historic. It was just sitting in their basement, beautiful treasure troves of film and photos and hard hats and lighters. And it's just, people don't know what's in their backyard or what's in their basement. There's so much, but thankfully, because of the community, I mean, I think I've been able to tell a story that feels holistic. At least to me, it does. Because people were okay with being vulnerable about a really, traumatic time of their life. So I couldn't have done it without the community. It was really like my favorite part about the documentary is simply just the making of it. The friends and family I've gained from it. I can't trade that in for anything. Well, thank you all. I had so much fun. I'm very grateful for the opportunity, Sarah and everyone at Media Burn. I get lost on their website, so I'm sure a good chunk of you know that I'll go in there, and it's hard for me to get out of there. I started looking up the Vietnam War. Next thing you know, I'm like, who knows where? I'm in another part of the world in a different time. It's one of my favorite pastimes. So I'm glad we were able to work together on this.
Don't question your abilities. You're a great filmmaker.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Stephen and Christine, both of you. This discussion has just been totally fantastic, and I love the clips of the film that I've seen. I can't wait to see more. So yeah, thank you everyone for coming. Again, you'll receive an email if you signed up for this, and it'll have a link to the recording and as many resources as we can provide you in terms of following the journey of this film. And then we would love to see you all in 2 weeks, February 2nd, same time, 6 p.m. We're going to be featuring Judith McCrae of Juneteenth Productions, talking about the new podcast, the new season of her podcast Change Agents, which follows young journalists following the stories of community activists in Chicago who are doing great work in communities of color. So yeah, thank you everyone for being here tonight. Thanks to Max Hart for doing the tech, and look forward to seeing you all again in the future. Good night.
All right.
Thank you.